Hello, how are you all tonight? Good, good. My name is Matt Bell. I'm a professor of creative writing, as well as the director of the ASU Worldbuilding Initiative. My voice is very loud. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our first distinguished lecture and the final event of our first semester in operation. It's a celebratory time. I'm really grateful for everything that's happened this semester for the Worldbuilding Initiative, and I'm glad that you're here to celebrate with us. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our partners at ASU, including the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Department of English, and the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing. Thanks especially to the staff of the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics, where the initiative is housed, including Karina Fitzgerald and Jan Long, who are in the back here, who did so much of the work to make these events happen. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Dean Jeffrey Cohen, who's in the audience tonight, who's instrumental in encouraging and supporting this initiative. For those of you joining us for the first time, either in person or online with us today, let me say briefly that the ASU Worldbuilding Initiative emerged out of classes on writing science and fiction and fantasy that I've been teaching here at ASU for the past several years. Many of the students are in the audience today, where students not only study sci-fi and fantasy, but also invent worlds of their own. The initiative seeks to take the kind of imaginative, speculative thinking that my students and I have been doing in those classes, work I think of often through Daniel Heath Justice's suggestion to imagine otherwise, and Ursula K. Le Guin's charge for us to become realists of a larger reality, to engage the wider humanities community at ASU and in the public. Our hope is to keep building and strengthening our community of innovative thinkers, artists, and futurists in the years ahead. And I hope that those of you present tonight will feel invited to continue to join us as we do. If there's some way you'd like to be involved in the future, or if there's some other activities you think we should be undertaking, I hope you feel free to reach out to me at any time. All right, it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished lecturer, Arkady Martine. Let me begin with her official bio, and then I'll add a few more words of my own. Arkady Martine is a speculative fiction writer and, as Dr. Anna Linden Weller, a historian of the Byzantine Empire and a city planner. Under both names, she writes about border politics, narrative and rhetoric, risk communication, and the edges of the world. She is currently a policy advisor for the New Mexico Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department, where she works on climate change mitigation, energy grid modernization, and resiliency planning. Her debut novel, A Memory Called Empire, won the 2020 Hugo Award for Best Novel, and its sequel, A Desolation Called Peace, won the 2022 Hugo Award in the same category. Arkady grew up in New York City, and after some time in Turkey, Canada, Sweden, and Baltimore, lives in New Mexico with her wife, the author Vivian Shaw. Martine's two novels, A Memory Called Empire and A Desolation Called Peace, tell the story of Mahit Dismar, an ambassador from an independent space station called the Cell, who first travels to the heart of the encroaching Tezcatlipocan Empire in order to secure her home's continued independence. It's a thrilling story of political intrigue, of friendship across societies, and how a person might simultaneously resist the reach of an empire, even as they're entranced and intrigued by its culture. The first novel is dedicated to anyone who has ever fallen in love with a culture that was devouring their own. Combined, both novels add up to a spectacular display of world building, with Martine drawing on the historical Byzantine and Mexican empires, but creating a place all her own, an imperial society characterized as much by its epic poetry as by its technological advances or military might. Martine's novels are beautifully written, sharp and witty, and always engrossing. These are two of my favorite novels of the past few years, and I hope anyone here who hasn't read them yet will do so soon. If these two books were all I admired about Martine, it would have been enough for me to invite her to campus. I'm also inspired by the other half of her life, in which she's a climate activist, an urban planner, and a policymaker, a variety of roles in which she is actively engaged in not only design of better futures, but their implementation. The kind of world building we do in science fiction and fantasy can be one way of trying to make better future possible. Designing policies, laws, and regulations meant to shape the world to come is another. It's a rare person who actively does both of these things. We're lucky to have one of them tonight to instruct and inspire us. As Martine once wrote, I learned bravery from dreaming of other ways the future might be. Tonight, I hope we'll learn the same from dreaming alongside her and alongside each other in community and solidarity. Please join me in welcoming Arkady Martine.
The first thing I'm going to do is make sure the mic works. Yes? Good. Awesome. Thank you so much for having me as your keynote speaker for this semester, I guess. It is a real honor and an absolute delight to be here. And thank you very much for that extremely kind introduction. I want to start in a sort of historical fashion. Actually, history is going to come up a whole bunch. And basically talk about what I was doing when I first began writing A Memory Called Empire and why. So I had just finished a PhD in Byzantine and Armenian medieval history, specifically focusing on border politics between Byzantium, at the time a advancing and expanding empire, an enormous cultural force, and the independent kingdoms of medieval Armenia, which at the time, this being the 11th century, were extremely culturally productive, but militarily kind of screwed. And I just spent like 10 years of my life thinking about this stuff. And I went to, after I finished my PhD, I was lucky enough to have a postdoc in Sweden, in Uppsala, at Uppsala University. And I was working on a book, as you're supposed to do in a postdoc. It turns out I didn't finish the book. I did finish the postdoc, but I then quit academia and started working in energy policy. So we'll see how that works. But in a lot of ways, A Memory Called Empire is the fictional version of the postdoctoral project I was working on in Sweden. And my research there was about the contacts between Byzantium and what Byzantines called the Eastern frontier. In my case, I was particularly interested in Armenia. And how those contacts were remembered and represented and narrativized by the people who lived through them. And the project is very much about borderlands as trauma spaces, about history and memory as attempts at narratively repairing the world. And A Memory Called Empire came out of that project and the previous 10 years of research into the history of imperialism, its methods and its horrors and its seductions. The very short version of how Byzantine history informed this book is as follows. In the year 1044 AD, the Byzantine Empire annexed the small Armenian independent kingdom of Ani. The empire was able to do this for a lot of reasons: political, historical, military, but the precipitating incident involved the Catholicos of the Armenian Apostolic Church. This is functionally a pope. And his name at the time was a man called Petros Getedar. And he was determined to prevent, no matter what, the forced conversion of the Armenians of Ani, who were members of the Armenian Apostolic Church, to what it would now be Greek Orthodoxy, the Byzantine Orthodox Church. And he wanted a guarantee from the Byzantine Emperor that this would never happen to his people, that their spiritual sovereignty would be preserved no matter what. And he got it. He got it by trading away the physical sovereignty of Ani, which became part of the Byzantine Empire, fully annexed, ruled by a Byzantine governor. And when I started writing A Memory Called Empire, my inciting question was, what's it like to be that guy? To betray your culture's freedom in order to save your culture? And I wouldn't have known how to ask that question or explore its answers without having been a Byzantinist, a historian. So the book is full of all of the ideas that I was obsessed with through most of my 20s, like how does an empire impose a narrative? How do people that narrative is being imposed on reuse and reshape that narrative? And my dissertation had been on letters from Byzantine diplomats stationed on the frontier, writing to each other, and how they use these very sort of rote forms of letter writing. Letters are super formulaic. But they used those to reinforce and make real for themselves a particular narrative about Byzantium as the cultural center of the world. Now they're out on the frontier, they're encountering situations and people who are extremely different from the cultural norms that they're used to. And they are not adapting to that. we have evidence from other documents that aren't their letters to each other, like chronicle histories written by Armenians, histories written by Arabs, that these people were doing some real politics. They were very involved with local culture, with local interests. But when they write to each other, they use the language they would have used if they were at home in Constantinople, and they use it in a kind of desperation. To make real again a world in which their culture is the most important, to impose that on their relationships. So these are political relationships that matter. It's not just they're writing to their friends. These political relationships have to be maintained in order to let these people keep their jobs. So that fascinated me very, very deeply. And I was thinking when I got to this postdoc about how do we distinguish between narrative constructed for the purposes of maintaining your own culture and narrative constructed for the purposes of telling your people what happened when something went horribly wrong. So I looked at a bunch of Armenian historiography in comparison with those letters. And of course, I had very large feelings about all of this. And this is a thing that I think that academics should spend a little bit more time admitting. And I'm not formally an academic anymore, so I guess I'm cheating here. But we do have an affective response to our research, or at least I think we ought to, even if it's one of just sort of atavistic fascination. And for me, the deepest emotional reaction that I had to studying these people and studying these ideas was that I really, really was identifying with some of them myself, and had very powerful emotions about the kind of crux of imperial assimilation that they were stuck in. And you can't write about that in your postdoc book. You could, but it changes what kind of book you're writing, and then you probably can't get it published. And you have to switch departments, and it gets confusing. So you have to take some emotionality and directness out of professional academic writing, and I couldn't stop thinking about it, though. So here's the thing. History is the trade secret of science fiction. Now, I have been reading science fiction since I was old enough to read things, which has been a very long time at this point. And science fiction is the genre that I write in when I'm not actively trying to do something else. It's sort of the native language. And I had at the time, simultaneous doing all this academic work I just talked about, I had been publishing short fiction in science fiction magazines for about half a decade. And I had come to a point where I really wanted to write a novel. So the novel I wrote was where all of those emotions and thoughts and affective response to questions of empire, questions of how people build worlds that maintain themselves, and why people might need to do that, might do very bad things in order to be able to do that. All of that became source material, feed material for this book. So the past is very alien, which is actually a benefit for writing science fiction. It's super weird back there. And Byzantine history has things in common with speculative fiction just to begin with. Byzantium has this high, complex literary culture that's obsessed with citation. Now, if you hang out in sci-fi fandom, you will also realize that you are in a relatively sophisticated literary culture that is obsessed with knowing its canon and its history and being able to quote that at the drop of a hat to acquire social status. Now, this is how Byzantium works. It is also how my Tixkoladli Empire works. It's a direct lift. I still lift flat. And Byzantium also has this tendency to retell itself. It retells its past, which is Roman, and it retells its future over and over again. That future is an imagined Christian apocalyptic future in which Byzantium is the last empire. And Byzantine literature employs and preserves ideological principles that support that past and that future, which are very specific. They're not the only ways to have them. And that tells me a lot about how fiction works in general, what fiction is for, what fiction might do for a society, how the literature of a society circumscribes and enables that society to imagine its own narrative. And as speculative fiction authors, as a science fiction author, this is really what we do all the time. We are imagining narratives of the future. We use literature to construct and interrogate an ideological construct of our own society and imagine it projected forward. And speculative fiction is particularly good at this because it's full of counterfactuals, and counterfactuals let us focus on a particular difference between the hypothetical world and our own. So let me give you one that came from the book. So in the book, there's a way of traveling faster than light. Now, did I do science on this? No, I did not do science. I did zero science on this. I decided it was going to work a particular way. And this is a really classic trick that I used. It's a citation from earlier science fiction. I used the idea of a wormhole, functionally. My jump gates are indistinguishable from wormholes that have fixed endpoints. There's other versions, but it's a classic science fiction trick. So you imagine like a wide bore needle that pokes through a piece of fabric and picks up a different part of the fabric on the other side and brings them together. That's what a jump gate does. If you go through the needle, you can go in either direction, but you can't get anywhere from part A and part B. There's no off branch. And point A and point B have no actual contiguous bits at all. So this produces a kind of patchwork of interstellar travel where you have system X and system Y, and they're hundreds of light years apart, but you can connect really easily. It's like, I don't know, driving downtown. And system X and system Z could be really close together. There's many colors surrounding this room for all of you on Zoom, and they keep changing. So if I look distracted, that's why. System X and system Z, they're really, really close. But close is not real in terms of space travel because you have to obey slower than light. And if you don't have good jump gate connections between X and Z, they're not close at all, even though physically they might be. So why did I do this? First of all, in the Textlanli universe, there is no faster than light travel that doesn't involve a jump gate. Hard rule, never going to break it. And the why of this is I wanted to mimic the communication and travel difficulties of a medieval empire, because that was where I had gotten my inspiration from. And I'm thinking, okay, so when the Byzantines sent their armies to conquer Ani officially, they couldn't send everybody at once. So there is this question, like if they sent everybody at once, it would be easy. They couldn't because mountain passes are difficult to put a lot of people through really fast. I want to mimic this. I don't want my space empire to be able to expand willy-nilly anywhere. I need to put a control here because I'm trying to imitate a political structure that might not exist in a far future space opera. So when I'm picking what kind of fast and light travel I want as the technical world building exercise, that's what I did. I picked the one that let me create the shape I liked. So basically I made up some really complex physics to reproduce this in the situation of a Byzantine army trying to get into the Armenian highlands. And there's a lot of world building in the book like that does that. And the reason why of that, like the shape that I was trying to recreate, the questions I was trying to ask, it comes from this sense of wanting to have a particular story world and wanting to think about what is going on that makes people make narratives to reproduce that world. And a lot of this comes from an academic discipline called narratology. When I was in Sweden I was part of a group that worked on sort of narratological concepts from different fields. I was the historian. We had an art historian. We had like a linguistics person. We had a straight up literature person. And narratology is broadly the study of narrative structures and the way in which humans perceive, create, and are influenced by them. And it's a type of literary theory. Like most literary theory, it is full of terms that seem overtly and deliberately obscure. Why, for example, do we need the term focalization when we've already got the perfectly good and fairly explicable concept of point of view? There are reasons, but they're really narrow. But what narratology does and what it did for me, what studying it did for me, especially in its newer forms, which I'm going to talk about in a second, cognitive narratology in specific, it gives us tools to think about not only the patterns in a narrative, but how narratives are part of how human beings understand and interpret events that happen to them in their everyday lives. So cognitive narratology, it focuses on the human intellectual and emotional processing of narratives, and it can get into neuroscience. It's super cool. I am not good at the neuroscience bit. Not that kind of scientist, never have been. But it really helped me as a historian to think about that because there are people. Every time you have something written down that we have from a millennia ago, somebody wrote that. And then, more interestingly, somebody else preserved it. And then someone else usually decided that it should be at least mentioned somewhere in an academic text. So your local grad student can be like, oh, no one worked on that. I'm going to work on that thing. And there's all of these little functional devices inside a narrative. How do they get processed by a person? How do different humans react differently to that? Why did medieval Byzantine historians put obviously fake events into their stories? There's a story about emperors riding bravely into battle where they were definitely not there, like not in the same part of the world, not there, but it needed to be there for some kind of reason. And it works for modern literature too. How come readers sometimes say they feel cheated when the author doesn't write the ending they expect? And why right now in the year 2023 is it so hard for human beings to recognize and understand information that contradicts a narrative they believe very strongly? So spent a bunch of time doing narratology, and I got obsessed with the idea of why do we want stories to make sense? So at the heart of cognitive narratology, really at the heart of this whole mysterious discipline of narratologists, is a concept called the story world, which is a word I've mentioned before. It's named by the cognitive narratologist David Herman, and it's both intuitively super simple and it has really deep consequences. A story world, we can define this as a possible world that is constructed by not just the narrative on the page, but the cognitive results in the reader or watcher or perceiver of the process of comprehending the story, cued by the author, and completed by the reader's own context. So when I'm reading a story, I have my own personal experience that I'm bringing to that story. I'm bringing what I know about the world. I'm bringing my own political, social, ethical beliefs. The story is the same if I'm me or if I'm my brother. My brother and I argue about politics all the time. Could read the same story, take really different ideas about what the world is like inside that story based on the combination of his cognitive universe and the story versus my cognitive universe and the story. So the story world is the combination of the text and the reader working on the text. It's bigger than any one narrative. It's not just what you write down. It's like a mental model of the whole universe inside the book. It's the world building. And it contains all the possible events, persons, places, and interactions in the narrative and all the ones that could have happened and didn't or might be happening, and you don't see them. It's a co-created world between author and audience. So, sorry, I have way too many notes here. And the interesting thing about this is that a story world becomes a set of shared communal knowledge when people talk about it. We can call this like the encyclopedia, and I'm stealing that from a French theorist. And the encyclopedia varies with social cultures, groups, and historical epochs. So the shared communal knowledge of us here is not going to be the same as the shared communal knowledge of a Byzantine intellectual in the 10th century, which isn't the shared communal knowledge of a group of Byzantinists talking about that guy. All different. So the reader slash perceiver's knowledge about the story world is the fictional encyclopedia, which is the world building, all of the things that could exist in the world. And therefore, we can kind of think that story worlds aren't actually confined to fiction. They work for real ideology too. And this is where I want to kind of briefly jump, and I'm going to wind this up fairly fast, but briefly jump into what I do now, because I'm not a Byzantinist anymore. Well, that I am a Byzantinist. You never really stop is the thing, which I don't know if it is encouragement to the students in this room to, oh, go get the PhD, you'll be fine, because no, but also yes. So what I do now is I do climate and energy policy, and I came to that through city planning and thinking about cities and infrastructure a very great deal. And the reasons that I did that I swapped that way are complicated. They partially had to do with things like the world in 2016 looked a lot different than the world in 2007, which is when I started doing Byzantine history. But also things like one of the ways that world looked different was that there weren't any jobs that I wanted to do that involved moving every 3 years. So you make choices. What I want to briefly talk about is how we imagine cities and how science fiction imagines cities. I read this book during lockdown called Cities That Think Like Planets. I'm not going to talk very much about it, but I want to start with that title because that book really thinks of cities as like an ecology, a place that's like an interlaced, autonomous, fractally complex system. The book is by Marina Alberti, if you want to go look it up. And cities as living organisms, which implies a really science fictional concept, cities that think. That's everywhere in science fiction. Cities that think like planets is even more so. So it conjures some familiar wonders, like Coruscant from Star Wars, a city that is entirely one planet. Or the sprawl in William Gibson's Neuromancer, one long megatropolis up and down the East Coast of the United States. And this goes all the way back to some of our foundational science fiction texts. Fritz Lang's film Metropolis, for example, perhaps the first visual science fiction city, a vertical skyscraper-based fusion of Art Deco, modernists, and Gothic architectural styles. And none of these cities are particularly good or nice places to live. The city in science fiction is usually pretty dystopic. It's striated socially and economically, and it's coded so by verticality, usually. So you have like rich people live on the top of the skyscraper, everybody else is down in the smog. Think about Blade Runner and the Los Angeles of Blade Runner. That's kind of the apotheosis of this idea, a damp, neon glistening, post-industrial ruinscape that extends upward at the same time. And this is not exactly unlike how many cities we encounter in our own lives function. I'm a New Yorker. Manhattan might as well be Metropolis on its worst days. It is not yet LA circa Blade Runner. Some mercies still remain. Nevertheless, the aesthetic of the city is a science fiction aesthetic. It's that way for good or for ill. And the architecture of that city is a way that creators who write science fiction often encode what we think of when we think of the future. The future is smog for people underneath and skyscrapers reaching up toward heaven inhabited by monsters. That's what we think about when we think about the future city. And it's a surveillance city too. It's a city that tracks us. And that comes from real experience. Many of the things that were only imagined in the 80s are now here right now. Right this minute, there are about somewhere between 250 and 300 million street surveillance cameras in Shanghai. That is a lot of being watched. So the science fiction city of past imagination. It's no longer a future to be desired or warned against. It's present, it's right here. And if it's a present that we live in, then the question remains for both science fiction writers and city planners, policy people. What's the science fictional city of the future now? If we're living in the science fictional city of the past, why have we closed this idea so hard? We still write the same kind of future city, despite that the fact that we've moved toward it. These aren't only questions for writers, though they are and should be questions that writers think about, but they're questions for anybody who lives in a city or anyone who works on one to build it or plan it or administer it. We're all telling stories about how we want to live in the future. Writers, city dwellers, government workers, urbanists, everyone. This is where I come back to the idea, okay, let me go back to a city that thinks like a planet. What the heck is that? What does that look like? Can I even get there? And the very first thing that the author of that book asks the reader is, what futures are we unable to imagine? And I am stuck on that one. Like, that is a fishhook. So what we've got is a challenge. How do we do this? And we have problems that we are going to need to apply this idea of creating a story world, a collective imagination of world building, that we really need this kind of now. We've got climate change, we've got pandemics, we've got an accelerating urbanism. More people live in cities now than ever have before. That will continue for the foreseeable future. How do we get there? We have to imagine them into being somehow. So science fiction is a way, sort of, maybe, possible. I'm not saying science fiction is an answer, because science fiction doesn't tell us what the future is. Science fiction is, we're really bad at being futurists. Most of the ones of us who were right also worked for large governments and therefore could make us right. But what in the complex system of the city doesn't work now? What could work differently? What could we imagine differently? So writers out there, planners out there, government people out there, show us garden cities and make them not paradises. Singapore isn't one. Show us planet-sized cities and think of their transportation systems, of where they might get their food, the raw materials for all of that building. Show us a city that is never any taller than 50 feet above the earth, but is still a city and still a future. Show us a city where no one feels safe enough to share air with anyone else, and the city has grown around that fear, accommodated it in every structure, the shape of its avenues, the tech its citizens use. Show us a city based around geothermal steam heat generation, a city in drought, a city that opens and shuts like a flower, letting the ocean in as it rises. Show us a city that would be built by carnivorous quadrupeds. A city where the electric car revolution happened in 1917, which it almost did. A city where the needle skyscrapers of the billionaire class were made into space elevators, or grain silos, or churches. A city run like a community garden, a city run by an emergency management department and nobody else. A city that is entirely bridges, a perfectly just city, or how there never can be such a thing. A city that thinks like a planet or otherwise. We are going to need to have some new ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. It was really fantastic.
You're very welcome.
I feel like I'm going to think about that list of cities for a long time, and I want to add
Had that
to
one
it
for a
and
while.
keep thinking about it. It's really great. I love that question of like, what futures are we unable to imagine? I always blank on the guy's name, but the author who wrote Schindler's List talked about like one of the things you could set as a goal as a writer would be to write about the evil that right now no one acknowledges. In 50 years, everyone will say, how did I miss that? And there's some version of that. And like, what are the futures we're able to imagine?
The corollary to what can't we imagine is why not?
Right.
And that's where it gets interesting. Like just identifying the gap only gets you so far. Yeah. The real question is, if there's a gap, why is there a gap? Why can't we do this? And then the nasty part after is, how do you change that?
Yeah, easy, right?
Completely simple.
I thought maybe just talk a little bit about further about sort of like what makes an imagined future worth thinking about. I know for myself, I often judge like imagined futures by like a couple metrics, like who they include, who's there, who's thriving, what does that thriving cost other people or cost the world? And like those are some of the ways I think about it. For you, do you have your own metrics for like judging imagined futures? What makes an imagined future sort of interesting or useful or evocative?
This is going to sound really flippant, but it isn't.
Yeah.
Is it boring?
Yeah.
Have I seen this before? Do I know all of the plot beats that have to come here? Like, is this yet another story about X?
Yeah.
I'm not interested. Unless someone can crack it open somehow. I don't know if I evaluate worlds that other writers build on a sense of usefulness. I actually, despite the lecture I just gave, I don't actually think that reading a book is a radical process. I think that it can engender one, but it does not necessarily do so. And writing a book does not fix things.
Right.
It is possibly an experiment that lets you crack open your own barriers in yourself and communicate what you've learned by doing that. But reader response is reader response. It is the reader that brings energy from what they have read. Writing books doesn't save the world. Sometimes it helps you think of ways to save the world. So I don't spend a lot of time thinking about usefulness of other people's narratives, except when I think, oh, this is really not useful, which is a personal reaction to something. Sometimes it's, oh my God, this book is so preachy. Like they are saying the things I want to be said. They're saying it in a way that is not only probably turning off everybody else, but turning off me who agrees with them. And it's because it's super obvious what they're doing. I have a horror of the obvious, however, so like I might not be the best judge.
I was really struck by the way you were talking about like the imagined science fiction cities of the future, and that we've come to maybe inhabit some of those like futures, but haven't replaced them in science fiction. I don't even know if I totally have a question about that. I just think that that's a really interesting thought problem. Like, how have we not imagined past this like inherited sort of sci-fi city into something new? What would it mean to do that?
I think that it's something that's particularly pernicious in the Anglophone science fiction tradition. There's and the Western Anglophone tradition, because I don't want to talk about the Indian subcontinent, which I think is doing some very interesting, very different things with that kind of city building, space building. But you're really stuck in English language science fiction written in the Americas and in the UK with it's very tall, it's very dirty, and it's very capitalist.
Which is more just like continuing to identify the problem as opposed to moving in a new direction.
It's also like, it's not even really identifying the problem anymore, because if you look at that stereotypical science fictional city, it's really the same problem that Gibson identified in like the late 80s, early 90s. So it's not even our current problem. It's like a version of our current problem that makes a good story.
Yeah, I like that distinction a lot. I think I know with the time we have, I'd love to open it up to the audience. People in the room have questions. Karina will come by with a microphone, and I will keep an eye out for online ones. Yeah, please, Penny. Can you want to come down to Penny and then maybe Verge here in the front?
Hi. So you told us earlier today that you started with short stories and then moved into Memory Called Empire, and then had the idea for the second book, and now have other books in that universe. So what is something that you wish you had known about the world building process way back at the beginning, now that you've created this whole universe and know much more about it?
So it wouldn't have worked. I couldn't have done it as I was writing. But when you write a sequel, you need to not contradict things you have done in book one, including little things like, naming people. or remembering where things are in relation to each other, or the order that events go in. So a lot of people keep like world building journals, or like I know some people make their own like wikis. I could not do that while I was writing, but I did have to go back and make one afterward when I started writing the second book, just so that I knew who everyone was and if I had actually named that person.
Absolutely. First place in the print.
So I was always kind of like nebulously aware of city planning until a couple of years ago. There was this guy on TikTok. There was some major flooding going on in a city, and he was telling people like, "Hey, if there's a storm drain in your area,
oh
like,
yeah, the storm drain
go on
guy.
and block it."
Yeah. Awesome.
And he also did like parking design too. And so I guess what I want to ask is, what has been one of your favorite things in like city designing and stuff like that that you have done?
That I personally have done.
Yeah.
So I did, my current job is like not exactly city planning, though it is highly related to it. So I can think back to a previous job where I helped design a sort of where you would put a subdivision if you were going to expand a county seat in a way that didn't destroy the visual or agricultural like capacity of the land. And that was incredibly difficult. And some of it was predetermined by hydrology, which I didn't expect to be my problem. I expected trees to be my problem. Trees were a fixable problem. The direction which you can get sufficient water and sewer lines for the number of people you need to house, they have to basically run downhill at least a little bit, unless you want to break your budget on something no one will see for no particular reason, except, you know, to preserve the large heritage farm. It was, I think, the first time that I was part of a project where the complexities were actually deeply beyond me. They required other disciplines. And planning is one of those fields where, as the planner, you're kind of the central control room, and you need input from the hydrology people, from the geology people, from the agriculture people, from the historical preservationists, from the conservationists, from the incredibly annoying people on the city council. Because if you don't listen to them, then your project doesn't get approved. You spent 6 months doing nothing. So it's, for someone who started out their life doing a career which is a lot of being alone in a room with extremely old things, becoming a planner like never fixes being an introvert, but it erases your imposter syndrome because you just don't have time. You need to be able to talk to people.
Maybe we'll take a question from one of the online audience members. It's from Ryan Berger, who first says, "Thank you for doing this wonderful event." So thank you for doing this. Could our Katie talk a little bit about her naming process for the naming convention of the text Kalani, which as you have in the book is always like a number followed by a noun. It's one of the most interesting parts of her world, but also for Ryan, one of the most immediately jarring. I wonder how early the idea entered the story, and if you got pushback from people, from readers or editors, that it was too hard for something so massive, like how characters in the book are named, for how people are going to relate to characters.
So I came up with it on the spur of a moment, which I actually told the class I talked to earlier today. I'm literally writing like the first scene of the book, and I need to make a major differentiation between my protagonist and the first person she meets. I want it to feel really jarring. And I just like blindly reached for something that would work. I like number name. It comes from Mesoamerican naming structure, specifically the Mixtec people. And it's for holy names and imperial names. I used it for everybody, which is not a direct lift, but it's very much from that culture complex. And I like it because it is alien. It's meant to be alien. It should be a little alienating. And it's also a fun way to communicate, that I can communicate about what a culture thinks is important. Like, okay, so I'm doing numbers and nouns, which numbers and which nouns and why?
Yeah.
And I very rapidly began to sort of generate that for myself. I got extremely little pushback from my editor on it. I got one question, which was, is this the way you want to do it? And I said, yeah. And she said, okay. And that was literally the only thing we ever talked about. I have gotten not pushback, but confusion from readers, which is a hazard of the job. And quite honestly, okay, it's not meant to be easy.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that was interesting in our own class with it even was that for some people it did make the culture feel more alien than the one where people at least had first and last names, even if they were first and last names you weren't familiar with. It did make it seem different in a certain way. Yeah, I did do that work. Well, of course, yeah, please. Oh, sorry, Karina's gonna come stand. We'll come right back to you.
So one of my favorite parts of studying history is discovering anecdotes so bizarre that they'd feel unbelievable in a novel, like Porphyry and the Whale's Reign of Terror. Have you included any favorite bits of historical weirdness in your work? And if so, did you struggle to make them feel believable?
God, everything is way weirder. Like the world is way weirder than fiction. You can get away with more recounting actual things that happen than you can writing them, because your editor will be like, that wouldn't happen. Like, last week, actually, that occurred. But have I stolen a particular historical thing and put it in? No, I have not. There are some that I could imagine doing. There's a lot, but really the weirdest stuff is the reasons that people make decisions. And then also people acting in completely inexplicable ways. I mean, the classics are like the Florida man stories, where you're like, all of those people are people. If that happens to people, that could happen to people.
Fantastic talk. So what, I guess, emerging trends or prospects in the planning of cities, either real or fictional, are you most excited about?
I love grid modernization. I'm an electricity nerd. I always have been. Like, this predated the city planning thing, but it became a big focus of what I did. I got into infrastructure specifically through being interested in electricity, being interested in electricity markets, in regionalization, in the deregulation of the 90s and the subsequent disasters in California about PG&E and things burning down, and et cetera. So this is one of those things where I will talk about it forever if I'm allowed. There is a huge amount of money available right now from the federal government to do a nebulously defined thing called grid modernization, which mostly, in some ways, involves redoing infrastructure that hasn't been updated for 50 years. And some of the reasons why we get those particular disastrous utility-caused wildfires are that our substations and our lines haven't been updated since the 1920s. And then they will fall over. And it's not because they were built badly, it's because metal fatigue. And does the company have money to go and replace every single one? Utility companies are, regulated monopoly utility companies are entirely funded from ratepayers. So you want to replace everything? Everybody's electricity bill goes up. How do you balance that? How do you prevent people from dying in wildfires fast enough without making everybody unable to pay their electricity bill? Because if no one can pay their electricity bill, the utility also doesn't have any money. Yeah. So I love this stuff. And it's very interesting to think about consequences of this stuff. Science fictional ones or just regular ones. And it is a big part of what I and my colleagues in New Mexico are trying to work through is, what does that look like in a non-deregulated state with an enormous number of rural electric co-ops that we have no control over, and some central utilities that haven't been focused on that and haven't necessarily needed to be. So what do we do as policy people? Like, what's the angle here? We have all this money floating around. What would we spend it on?
Thank you. I don't even know. We'll take another one online.
Hello, thank you for this talk. I've read Memory Called Empire and immediately picked up Desolation Called Peace right afterwards. And one of the things that was really interesting to me about Desolation Called Peace is the question of how far does we go? And I'm interested in that, like in world building, in reality, that question of like how far does we go? What is the relationship between people? Like, could you speak more about that?
So that is the central question of the sequel to Memory Called Empire is like basically where are the borders of people you can communicate with? What's people, essentially? And that's not saying what's human. I'm saying what's people. And it is a question that's super, super hard to answer. And it's also a question that if you ask it and you really start thinking about it, you notice that sometimes right near you, there are humans who have decided that other humans are not people for various reasons. And the encounter between groups of sentiences that have decided that the other group is not people, they go really badly. So I wanted to write a book about, okay, how do you get out of that? Can you get out of that? What would be required to get out of that? My solution to what would be required is a little extreme for everyday practicality. But it's a question that's too big to answer in a book. You can only ask that question, which is part of what I like doing in science fiction, to ask a question that's too hard.
Feels like a great, like even marching order for an assignment, right? Like ask a question in your fiction that's too hard. You know, seems like a really great. Yeah. I love the way you asked that too, thinking about the way like the first book often asks like, what do you mean by you? And the second book is like, what do you mean by we? Like the way that turn happens. I'm just going to take one from online. That's from Joy Pierce, who asks, is it possible to have too much or too little of world building when it comes to story planning and writing? How much of world building should one do?
However much you need. Bad answer, but also the only actual one. Because what that question really is how do I write a good book? And the answer to that is in whatever way enables you to do that, you specific, not you collective. I do find personally that I don't spend a bunch of time creating like a whole world. I looked at like some of the really popular world building methods you can find online ones, like the snowflake method thing, where you're supposed to start with, okay, so what are your oceans like? And proceed through geology to ecology to ancient history. And I'm like, at some point I meant to write a book, I think. So I world build what I need for the story. Sometimes a little bit more. But there's whole areas of Tixkala I know very little about, or that I didn't know existed while I was writing Memory and discovered existed when I was writing Desolation.
Can I ask maybe a related question from Jennifer Schmidt online? Said, what part of world building is often forgotten or overlooked as an effective story? Where should a world builder, in quotes, be careful and not let something go unseen or overlooked? Is there something you feel like people often don't look at in their world building?
Science fiction writers especially tend to forget about cultural markers because science fiction as a discipline and as a field that talks to itself was initially very based around like a 1950s, 1960s Anglo-American idea of the scientist who tends to be a white guy. And the stereotypical white guy, with apologies to white guys who are not like this, does not care about clothes, music, fashion, food, architecture, beauty, flowers, perfume, most media, except for the bits that he really does care about. That guy is very boring. Sometimes if you have come to science fiction through reading a lot of stories about that guy or through the eyes of that guy, you forget that there's a great many people in any world who are not that guy and who are interested in all of those, I'm not going to say girly because that's wrong, femme things, ways of perceiving the world. I think, I would argue for make sure that you have included enough femme stuff in your world building. And I mean that in the extremely queer sense.
Yes. Yeah, it sounds great. I mean, I remember reading Isaac Asimov's Foundation for the first time just recently. And if I remember right, someone will yell at me about this on the internet, feel free to. There's like one woman in Foundation, and she tries on a necklace for like half a page, and that's the only function of anyone who's not a male mathematician.
There's a couple of people who do other things there, but it's not exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm not really talking about like include representation.
No, I know you're not.
Include different ways of deciding what's important.
Absolutely. Yeah. Great. Jaeger's been waiting down here in the front.
Hi, I was just going to ask, based on your background in urban planning and policy, what is something you find science fiction writers often miss when developing their own fictional city?
There are people in it, a lot of them. And in fact, that would be why there is a city in the first place. This sounds really basic, but it's not, because when you think about how do people build a science fictional city, they think, okay, so this is what it looks like architecturally. Right. And I mean, I start there too, because like I love architecture, so I'm interested in that. But there's a fundamental question, which is, why do people live here? And you can answer that question in a million different ways. People can live there for economic reasons, like pure economic reasons even. There are jobs there and there are not jobs somewhere else. They can live there for historical reasons, like people have lived here for a very, very long time. Those turn into economic reasons if you follow them deep. And then they turn into geological reasons if you follow them deeper. Cities tend to be on rivers. Cities tend to have access to some mode of faster transportation than things you can do on your feet or with one animal and the wheel. But cities also accrue in places that are super artificial. Mm-hmm. You can think of cities built around sports stadiums. Why does that happen? What happens to the city after the Olympics or your world's equivalent thereof? Does it stay? Sometimes it does. Does it fall apart? Sometimes it does. And then was this city purpose-built to be like a model city? So Brasilia or Chandigarh, all of the Le Corbusier projects. Yes. Do people live there? Yes. Do they do some of the things that Le Corbusier imagined them doing? Yes. Do they do many other things that probably Le Corbusier would not have liked? Oh my God, have we talked about a favela recently? So cities have people in them. The people are there for a reason, whether the people have chosen that reason or not.
Hi. With regards to imagination and world building, both big and small, a lot of our imagination is derivative of what we already know in many fields. What I was wondering is imagining things that are less familiar, things that are more impossible to imagine per se. Do you think that there's some utility in that? Do you think there's a limit to that utility in terms of if we can comprehend it? And what's one of your more preferred methods for that sort of imaginative imagination?
A really interesting question. I think that it is difficult for us to, as humans, to imagine things that are not somewhere within the architecture of our internal story world. They could be very minor. They could be something that we haven't really spent much time on. It's really hard to get outside that. And quite honestly, I'm not sure that the attempt is worth the effort. I do think, and I do this myself, my favorite way to get new story ideas is to read nonfiction in a field I don't know. Mm-hmm. It is enormously transformative. And you don't have to know everything about it. You can just like, oh, that's super cool. I'm taking that bit. And from over here, I'd like this bit. So you get like the Texas Reliability Entity and octopi have brains in their arms. What if I squish those? Oh shit, I have a smart grid that can think. And not that people haven't thought of that one, but for 2 seconds of work.
There was a time when I was a really young writer where that always happened because I didn't know anything about anything. You read like half an article about something, you're like, story, right?
Yeah. And so I actually like some of mine. I published a novella last month, which is available online. It's called Rose House, if you're interested. It's not a Texcalon book. It's another thing. But the deep genesis of that story came from a extremely weird New Yorker profile I read in 2012.
Yeah.
So this is more than a decade later. And it's not like the whole thing. It was about I got like three things out of it: an architect and an archivist who had a very weird relationship. And the fact that after the architect died, he had himself made into a diamond. And that was kind of an origin point. I just kept thinking about it because it was weird and strange. And the article was beautifully written. And eventually it turned into a story that has all of those things in it and nothing else from the article.
I have time for like one last question, please.
I feel a little awesome on the last question.
There's all the pressure, you know?
First and foremost, I'd like to thank you for coming out to the event. And my question is, I'm working on a piece where a civilization is focusing on rebuilding after a rebellion, and they've been fighting for a decade and some change, but they haven't really built their city and haven't really rebuilt. They've only built it to last and sustain themselves, to try to sustain themselves against another empire. So what I'm thinking of in terms of that story is, how do I go about, or how do you think would be best to rebuild it with your city planning experience? What do you think would be best to tackle something like that?
That is really interesting. So two things. One, humans in a situation of crisis tend to be extremely good at helping each other, much more than normal. Like far to a degree that it's been written about in many academic and non-academic articles. Second thing, after the crisis is over, humans are really, really bad at doing that. In fact, they become almost hyper selfish briefly because they have the opportunity to. And we are hierarchical plains apes, and we are not over that, and we will never be over that as long as there are humans. We have to figure out different ways of working with that. So what you're describing sounds like, okay, these people have been in one form of crisis or another for a long time and have a unifying principle that animated their effort to keep themselves going. Both of those things are now gone. So what you've got is a lot of kind of jury-rigged stuff, like because 10 years, a decade plus, there will be a water system for people to get water from. There will be some kind of light generating thing. There'll be some kind of food generating thing. It's a long time to live in a place. Are those things built the way they would be built if there wasn't a crisis? No, they're going to be built differently. So start there. How did they get built the first time? Now, people start to have time to think about, what if I wanted it to be better? What if I wanted the lights to be on all day, not just for the requisite hours that I get, like electricity ration? What does that person do? Is that person the kind of person whose dominant mode of social interaction is, I'm going to lead the activist group, and they're all going to get together and like plan the perfect thing? That turns into about an argument about what's the perfect thing. And you have one kind of story. Is this person super selfish for themselves? And they're like, well, we're not at war, so it doesn't matter if I siphon electricity. That changes the story. That's a different story. But what if both of those things happen at the same time? There's a lot of fun things you could do. Imagine what you started with in a situation of crisis, like what that would look like if people had to build constantly while having things torn down. And then what happens when all of that pressure is released? What do people try to fix first? And how does that fixing go? That's where I'd start.
Thank you. I love that question. Nice to get to watch your brain work through that kind of world building problem live. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you all.